It was a chilly evening, the kind where the wind bites through your coat, and people rush past, heads down, eager to get home. In the corner of a small dimly lit diner sat an old beggar, his clothes worn and torn, his face etched with the lines of time and hardship. His hair was a wild tangle of grey, and his hands shook slightly as he counted the small change he had left. Just a few coins, hardly enough for a decent meal. But tonight, the old man wasn't thinking of himself. A few tables away, a young man had just walked in. He looked well off, clean-cut, with a confidence that turned heads as he made his way to a seat. Dressed in a sharp suit, he ordered a hearty meal, seemingly unfazed by the cold or the hum of the diner around him. He didn't notice the old man watching him, his eyes filled with something deeper than hunger. It was curiosity mixed with a sense of purpose. As if the beggar knew something no one else did. The diner wasn't crowded, but it had its regulars. A few construction workers, a couple of students, and the waitress, who barely glanced at the old man anymore. He was a familiar face around the block, always sitting quietly in the same corner, asking for nothing but warmth. Most people ignored him, assuming he was just another homeless person down on his luck. But that night, something about the young man caught the beggar's attention. He couldn't explain why, but there was something about him that felt important. As the young man's meal was placed before him, steaming hot and fresh, the beggar made a decision that would change both their lives forever. He rose slowly from his seat, gathering his last few coins in his trembling hand. With quiet determination, he shuffled over to the young man's table. The diner's background chatter seemed to fade as he approached, his heart pounding in his chest. Would the young man laugh at him, dismiss him like so many others had? Or would this small gesture be enough? The old man's voice was barely above a whisper when he spoke, but there was a firmness to his words. "Son, I'd like to pay for your meal." The young man looked up, surprised, almost confused. He glanced at the old beggar's ragged appearance, then at the meager handful of coins in his hand, hardly enough to cover even a fraction of the cost. For a moment, it seemed like he was about to decline, maybe even mock the old man's offer, but something stopped him. The diner seemed to hold its breath as the young man finally spoke, his tone soft but serious. "Why would you do that? You don't even have enough for yourself." The old beggar gave a small smile, one filled with years of wisdom and understanding. "Because sometimes it's not about what you have. It's about what you're willing to give." The young man stared at him for a long moment, the weight of the beggar's words sinking in. Without another word, the old man placed the coins on the table and turned to leave, his back hunched but his spirit unbroken. The young man watched him go, something in his expression shifting, as if this brief encounter had stirred something inside him. He didn't know it yet, but the old man had just set in motion a chain of events that would reveal a secret neither of them could have imagined. As the door to the diner closed behind the old beggar, the young man sat in silence, his meal untouched. Who was that old man? And why had he spent his last bit of money on a stranger? He couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter was far from over, that there was more to the story than met the eye. But what the beggar didn't know, what no one in that diner knew, was who this young man really was. Behind his polished exterior, the young man carried a story of his own, one that was about to collide with the beggar's in ways neither of them could foresee. And so, as the night grew colder and the wind howled outside, the story of the old beggar and the young man was just beginning. What would happen next? Why did the beggar sacrifice his last few coins? And who was this mysterious young man really? Stay tuned, because this story is about to take a turn you won't see coming. The wind whipped through the streets as the old beggar made his way back to the bench where he usually spent his nights. The city was unforgiving to people like him, but he had long learned how to survive with very little. Tonight, though, something felt different. It wasn't just the chill in the air or the rumbling in his empty stomach. It was the young man's face, the way he had looked at him. For a brief moment, the old beggar thought he'd seen recognition in the young man's eyes, but that didn't make any sense. Who would remember someone like him as he sat down on the cold bench, pulling his thin coat tighter around him? His thoughts wandered back to a time when things weren't always this bad. There had been days when he wasn't living on the streets, when he had a family, a job, and a life that made sense. But life has a way of knocking people down, and for him, it had been one hit after another, a series of bad choices, lost opportunities, and circumstances he couldn't control had landed him where he was now. Still, there were moments like tonight that reminded him that even in the darkest times, kindness mattered. Meanwhile, back in the diner, the young man couldn't shake the encounter with the beggar. He sat there, staring at the untouched meal in front of him, replaying the old man's words in his mind. Why had the beggar offered to pay for his meal? It made no sense, and yet there was something about the way the old man spoke. The look in his eyes, it felt personal, as if they were connected in some way he couldn't explain. The young man wasn't just any ordinary customer at the diner. His name was Michael, and he had built a life of success. By most standards, he had it all: wealth, status, and a reputation as a rising star in the business world. But deep down, there was a part of him that wasn't fulfilled. Growing up, his family had struggled. They had barely gotten by, and he had sworn to himself that he would rise above that life. And he had, but at a cost. Somewhere along the way, he had become disconnected from the simple things, the things that once mattered most. As Michael left the diner, the streets felt colder, harsher. He couldn't stop thinking about the beggar. There was something about the old man that tugged at his conscience, a feeling he hadn't experienced in a long time. That small act of generosity, offering to pay for a meal when he had nothing left, had triggered something in Michael, something he didn't fully understand. He found himself wandering through the city, lost in thought, until his feet took him to the park, and there, sitting on the same bench as always, was the beggar. The scene was almost surreal. The same old man, sitting alone, with nothing but the streetlights to keep him company. Michael hesitated, unsure of what he was doing. What was he hoping to find? "Hey!" Michael called out as he approached the bench. The beggar looked up, surprised to see him again. "Why did you do it? Back at the diner?" The beggar chuckled, softly, shaking his head. "You're still thinking about that, huh?" Michael sat down beside him, the chill of the metal bench seeping through his clothes. "I don't understand why you'd give up your last bit of money for someone you don't know." The old man's eyes softened as he looked at Michael. "You remind me of someone I used to know. Someone who once had nothing but still gave everything. It wasn't about the money, son. It was about making a choice, one that felt right in the moment." Michael frowned, feeling the weight of those words. "Who did I remind you of?" The beggar sighed, looking down at his worn shoes. "My son. We haven't spoken in years. I don't even know where he is anymore, or if he'd even want to hear from me. I guess, in some strange way, offering to pay for your meal was my way of making peace with the past, even if it's just a small thing." Michael's heart sank as he realized the old man's story wasn't just about a random act of kindness. It was about redemption, about trying to make up for something lost. He thought of his own life, of the people he had pushed aside in his relentless pursuit of success. His father had always been there for him, working hard to provide. But Michael had grown distant. In the rush to build a name for himself, he had neglected the people who had been there from the start. "Maybe it's not too late," Michael said quietly. "Maybe you can still reach out to your son." The beggar smiled sadly, his eyes filled with regret. "Maybe. But sometimes life takes you too far in one direction, and by the time you look back, it's too late to change course." Michael's phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him out of the moment. He glanced at it. Another message from work. Another problem to solve. But as he looked at the beggar, sitting alone with nothing but his memories, Michael realized something had to change. This life he had built, the success he had achieved, it meant nothing if he lost himself in the process. The tension built between them, an unspoken understanding passing through the cold night air. Both men, from different walks of life, stood at a crossroads. Michael could feel it. A decision had to be made, but what would he choose? Just as Michael opened his mouth to speak, a voice called out from the shadows. A figure stepped into the dim light, and the sight of him made both Michael and the beggar freeze. The man's face was familiar, too familiar, and in that moment, everything shifted. Who was this man? Why did he seem to know them both? The answer was just out of reach, but one thing was certain. Nothing would be the same after tonight. The figure stepped closer, the dim light from the street lamp casting long shadows across his face. Michael's heart raced as he squinted, trying to place the familiar features. The beggar sat up straighter, his breath catching in his throat. Both men stared at the newcomer, waiting for him to speak. "You don't remember me, do you?" the man said, his voice low but firm. He looked directly at the beggar, but his words felt aimed at both of them. The old beggar squinted, struggling to recognize the man. There was something hauntingly familiar about him, but the years had blurred faces and names in his memory. "Who are you?" the beggar asked, his voice trembling. The man's eyes hardened. "I'm the son you walked away from." The words hung in the air like a cold slap, cutting through the tension. The beggar's breath hitched as he stared in shock, his mind racing. Could it really be him, his son? After all these years, Michael felt a lump in his throat. This was the man the beggar had just been talking about, the son he had lost touch with. And now, here he was, standing in front of them, the truth unraveling in a way none of them expected. The beggar's voice cracked as he spoke. I didn't know where to find you. I thought you'd forgotten about me." The son shook his head, bitterness lacing his words. "Forgotten? No, I never forgot. I watched you, Dad. I've seen you out here on the streets. I kept my distance, but I always knew where you were." The beggar's eyes filled with tears. "Why didn't you say something? Why didn't you come to me?" The son took a deep breath, struggling with his emotions. "Because I was angry. You left us when we needed you most. You abandoned everything. Mom, she never recovered. I couldn't understand how you could just walk away." The beggar hung his head, the weight of his past mistakes crashing down on him. "I'm so sorry," he whispered, barely able to meet his son's eyes. "I was lost. I didn't know how to fix things." Michael stood quietly, watching this painful reunion unfold. It was like seeing his own life play out in front of him. The beggar's story, his struggle to reconnect with his son, struck a deep chord in Michael. He realized how close he had come to following the same path, neglecting the people who mattered most. For a moment, no one spoke. The silence was heavy, filled with years of regret, anger, and sadness. But then, something shifted. The son, though still hurt, took a step closer to the old man. "I don't know if I can forgive you, but I came tonight Because I wanted to see you. I wanted to understand. The beggar looked up, hope flickering in his tired eyes. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I never stopped thinking about you. I'm proud of you, son. Even if I wasn't there to tell you. The son's face softened, his anger slowly giving way to something else. An understanding that maybe, just maybe, people could change. He had spent years resenting his father, but seeing him now, broken and repentant, stirred something different in him. Michael stepped forward, finally speaking. Maybe this is the moment to start over. You're both here now, and that has to mean something. The beggar nodded, wiping away a tear. I want to make things right if you'll let me. The son took a deep breath, the weight of the years falling from his shoulders. He nodded slowly. I'm not ready to forgive yet, but maybe we can try. To move forward, the beggar's face lit up with the smallest smile, a glimmer of hope he hadn't felt in years. Michael watched the two men, feeling a sense of closure, not just for them, but for himself. He realized how important it was to mend the relationships that mattered before it was too late. He made a silent promise to reach out to his own father, to make things right while he still could. As the three men stood together in the cold night, something had shifted. The beggar wasn't just an old man on the streets anymore. He was a father trying to rebuild what was broken. His son wasn't just an angry young man carrying the weight of his past. He was someone looking for a way to heal. And Michael wasn't just a bystander in their story. He had learned something crucial about life, about the choices we make, and the importance of the people we love. The wind howled softly through the empty park as the beggar and his son began to talk, their voices low but filled with the possibility of reconciliation. Michael watched them from a distance, a sense of peace settling over him. He didn't know what the future held for them, but tonight felt like a step in the right direction. And as he turned to leave, heading back to his own life, Michael knew one thing for certain. Sometimes the smallest gestures, the simplest acts of kindness, could change